Chinese proverb says, if you are planning for a year, sow rice. If you are planning for a decade, plant trees. If you are planning for a lifetime, educate people. That's our philosophy at Seeds of Peace, where we educate young leaders to transform themselves to transform the world. Our next speaker also translated this proverb into action. Ramu Damodaran recently retired as chief of the United Nations Academic Impact Initiative, aligning universities with the objectives of the United Nations. Please welcome Ramu Damodaran to the Global Peace Education Day Conference.
Thank you, Michael, for that introduction on behalf of Willow and Alexander, who are with me for this panel discussion on a culture for peace. This year's International Day of Peace happens to be the 40th anniversary of its first observance on September the 21st, 1982. I'm not sure how many of you can really see this, but if you looked at the New York Times of that day, the front page had a banner headline saying, US plans to send Marines back to Beirut. Reagan terms Israeli pullout essential. And most of the front page is about the crisis which occurred in Lebanon at that time. And then there are two other news items on the front page. The president urges the Congress to end the two-day rail strike, and NFL players start a strike as a contract impasse looms. So the entire front page of one of the leading newspapers in the world on that day was on issues that imperiled one form of peace or another. And when we talk of a culture of peace, we're also bringing to mind the phrase in the resolution of the General Assembly, which declared the International Day of Peace, which said it was intended to alleviate the tensions and causes of conflict, both within and among nations and peoples. And I think that's particularly important for us to remember, because the idea of the International Day of Peace in many people's minds is really that of ending hostilities or conflicts between governments and between nations. But it goes far beyond that to the culture that animates societies themselves, societies as a whole. And this year's theme for the 2022 International Day of Peace is emblematic of that: stop racism. Because racism within a community, within a country, within a society can be as perilous to peace, as violent of its culture, as armed conflict can be, and perhaps in many senses more sinister. We also wish to look at today the role of peace education. What exactly is it? How do you define it? Should it be a subject in itself, or should it be integral to other parts of education, of learning? Do we have a situation where we have a specific agency that is dedicated to peace education, or should every United Nations agency, as part of its mandate, be it food, be it health, be it education, include an element about teaching about peace and offering best practices and examples of how peace can be furthered and preserved? 1982, when this journey began, was still 5 years short of the first definition of sustainable development. It was 10 years short of the first Earth Conference held in Rio in 1992. And today, 40 years later, we realize that the concept of peace is not so much within societies and within nations, as the resolution said, but also within ourselves. And that is what, in our view, education can transform, and which is why we do hope that it will be possible, just as the world declared an International Day of Peace as a holistic concept, we can also consider an International Day of Peace education, where educators and students around the world, and this is by no means confined to universities and school classrooms alone, but is symbolic of the idea of lifelong learning, which the Sustainable Development Goals champion. and which allow us on that one day reflect on how best we can use peace education to further the broader concept of the International Day of Peace. I'd like to begin our conversation today by inviting Alexander, whom Michael had introduced, to speak. Alexander has many roles. There are two very relevant projects with which he's involved. He's the Vice President of the Unity Foundation, which has been one of the United Nations' strongest allies in the celebration of the International Day of Peace each year. And he's also involved with an initiative called Global Education Futures, both of which I think excite curiosity. The idea of unity in the cause of peace through education. Alexander?
Thank you so much, Ramu, and thank you for your eloquence and for bringing forward the spirit of peace so much also in your being. I wanted just to acknowledge and to honor that. You know, this panel that we have here, and I'm looking forward also to our engagement here with Willow, is really looking at how are we creating a culture of peace through education. And this question of what is a culture of peace, where does that exist? Often we would say, well, culture is something out there. You know, in New York, where I used to live there, I went to the United Nations International School. You know, if you went out to Long Island, you say, sure, I got culture, I got class, sure. But no, we're not talking about culture like that. How do we have it? How do we live it? How are we an expression of the culture? So for me, this comes down to the question of what it means to be human. When we ask the question of what the culture of peace might be, we have really to be called upon to reflect on, I like the expression, how do we human well? You know, using it as a verb. What does it mean to human well? What does it mean to actually be that expression of the universe in human form? A friend of mine who was actually a beekeeper was talking about the role of the bees and how every other animal and plant knows what bees do and depends on the bees to do it. So I wonder, what is it that humans do that all the other animals and plants know that we do and depend on us to do it? You know, in a very positive way, this is the question that stimulates my inquiry and also the inquiry into the education that is appropriate for cultivating a response to that lives in each of us. In a way, this question calls us to explore how then we human well in service of life. Because as Janine Benyus, who was one of the founders of biomimicry, said, life creates conditions for life. Do humans do this as well? Are we creating conditions conducive for life? So this is part of, I think, the exploration. And one of the things that peace education really can dedicate itself to, and I'll get into what Global Education Futures is doing in this framework, is looking beyond the questions of ending conflict. You mentioned this, Ramu. And the idea is that peace is not just the end of conflict, a neutral point, a 0 point, the lack of war. Peace is a positive engagement with life. It's proactive. Peace fundamentally asks us to engage our capacities for empathy for the other, and so directly related to questions of stopping racism, for example, as you were bringing up, Ramu. And it asks us to engage in the spirit of what it means to be alive on this planet at this time. How does life create conditions conducive for life again? So the transformations that our species can come into now, I believe, in my work as a researcher in the questions of the evolution of consciousness, is to look at the next stage in human evolution as calling for collective intelligence. We have so much in our education and in our ways of life that celebrates strident individualism and self-righteous independence. This does not have a place in an interdependent world, a world where we are so fundamentally interconnected that the lessons from quantum physics, The lessons from astrophysics as well, the very large scale, are showing what the quantum physicists talk about as entanglement, the true nature of the fact that nothing arises independently. We are all co-arising. How do we act that way? What are the implications for politics? What are the implications for learning? And here I'd like to get to the question that the Global Education Futures is very keen on, the idea of creating these learning communities that learn how to learn in harmony with the dynamics of their broader environments. We did a big research project on creating the conditions for evolutionary learning ecosystems. And there's a wonderful publication out on that. I don't want to get into the details of that here, but this issue of really thinking about our networks more as ecosystems, more as living things that we have to nurture and cultivate with each other. How can we be ecosystem gardeners for each other, not programmers of each other? I think this is a shift in education also that is very, very important, so that we are working with each other as not problems to be solved, but working with each other as opportunities for engagement and for celebrating life. So finally, as I'm wrapping here, just to mention that there's a shift in education moving from what was problem-based learning, what's called PBL, to project-oriented learning, where you get students working on projects, which is wonderful. More recently, they have come into competency-based learning, which is really just teaching the students the skills that they want to use in life. And I would like to add another layer, which might be called empathy-based learning. We have to learn to care, the care-why competencies, not just the mindset and the skill set, but the heart set of how to human well is fundamental for creating a culture of peace. And educational systems can foster these ways of creating the opportunities to learn how to human well, how to empathize with other living beings and also with non-living beings, with an entire ecosystem, with how can we empathize with the mountain? John Seed from Turtle Island Institute was writing about think like a mountain. What does that even mean? How can we begin to be the systems we wish to see in the world? I will end with that. Look at my chair. I wonder if you can see this here. On my chair, I have this little saying here. It says, be the systems you want to see in the world. If you look at that, it breaks down into three things. Not only be the systems you want to see in the world, but be you in the world. Be you in the world. Be your own voice. And it also asks us to recognize that the systems want to see. What does that mean? What's the empathy in looking at what is arising here and how can we celebrate that which is seeking to arise? Thank you so much for this opportunity to share some of my ideas with you.
Thank you, Alexander. And there are so many takeaways from your remarks. I was very moved by the reference of service to life. And the idea, of course, that the true creators of peace and the true dangers to peace are people themselves. And the moment people regard other people as problems and not opportunities, as you said, that's where the problem begins. And yes, the idea of an inner voice, if you will, that you must be the world. You cannot say the world is violating peace without implicating yourself, nor can you say the world must build peace without giving that responsibility to you. And all three thoughts that I culled, if I may, from your remarks, lead to Willow and her vocation. Service has been the leitmotif of one of the greatest non-governmental organizations that has partnered with the United Nations. It was present when the United Nations was created in San Francisco in 1945, the Rotary Club, and Willow looks after its peace builder clubs, and I'm sure she'll talk about that. And also the idea of peace education, a subject which she deals with as a program director in the Prem Rawat Foundation. Willow?
Thank you very much for that, Ramu, and thank you for everything you said, Alexander. It was very inspiring to me and very enjoyable. I hope I can really respond to that and take to heart what both of you have said. So in terms of Rotary International, for those of you who don't realize, it's, I believe, the largest nonprofit organization in the world. There are 7 areas of focus, one of which, and has actually been all along one of its areas of focus. As you mentioned, they had a seat there at the United Nations when it was formed, is that of peace and conflict. It's actually changed a little bit now. It's now called Peace and Conflict Prevention and Resolution. It used to be resolution, now it's also conflict prevention. And we will hear later today, I believe, Steve Killalay of the Institute for Economics and Peace, who has partnered with Rotary International. And he will speak about the 6 pillars of positive peace, which Rotary is really embracing now. And now I'll move on to the Peace Education Program offered by the Prem Rawat Foundation, actually free of charge in 80 countries and nearly 40 languages. I say nearly 40 languages because there are 4 new ones that are in translation. It's a simple program, very simple. It's a series of innovative workshops that help people discover their inner strength and personal peace. The workshops consist of short videos based on talks by best-selling author and peace advocate Prem Rawat. There are individual and group exercises, workbook activities, and facilitated reflections that vary the workshops, making them enjoyable and adaptable. And in speaking of what are the characteristics of the culture of peace, perhaps the 10 themes of the Peace Education Program reflect that a little bit. Those 10 themes are peace, appreciation, inner strength, self-awareness, clarity, understanding, dignity, choice, hope, and contentment. The program supports educational standards for social and emotional learning competencies, which include self-awareness, social awareness, responsible decision-making, self-management, and relationship skills. It can be adapted to specific situations. For example, we recently adapted it for use with 15 to 18-year-olds with shorter videos and more classroom activities. So the teaching methodology is always participant-centered. Rather than defining or describing personal peace to the participants, the program empowers individuals to reach their own understanding. The workshops are designed to promote critical and creative thinking, thoughtful discussion, and genuine reflection, which helps participants develop greater personal awareness and much needed resilience. So we've spoken about whether peace education should be a specific course or part of our entire learning. I firmly believe it has to be part of our entire learning. This simple course helps people focus and discover things very often that they've never felt that they were able to speak about. Very often people say during the course that no one ever mentioned these things to them before. I was speaking with a man who's part of the security system in Mexico yesterday, a lawyer. And he was saying how much the Peace Education Program helped him because he never had the opportunity to speak about these topics with his family or in school or with his colleagues. For him, he was taught men don't cry. Men don't have emotions. Men don't discuss these things. And it really has had such an impact on him that he is now bringing it into various elements of government and security within Mexico. Alexander, you spoke about empathy. One of the outcomes of this course is definitely empathy. People hear other people's points of view and realize, I don't really agree with what he has to say, but that's okay. I don't have to enter into conflict with him. I don't have to challenge him. He can feel one way about it and I feel a different way, and that's fine. The course has been used a lot in correctional facilities, and there are many of the participants say that they came into incarceration and into the course with the thought that everything that happened to them was someone else's fault. They've blamed everybody for everything. And as they start taking the course and becoming more self-aware, they realize that maybe they made the wrong choices. Maybe it wasn't actually everyone else's fault. And this discovery is actually very liberating for them. So I could go on and on about this course and what people learn through it, but I think I will throw it back over to you, Ramu, to not monopolize the conversation.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Willow, because really the point that both you and Alexander mentioned about empathy, my only concern about that, and I'd like to pose this to both of you, is whether empathy is in some ways too weak a word. Do we need education to inculcate something more forceful, more strong than just a feeling of living together or kinship? I realize that this is really a question of semantics largely, but I think it is important because we must also try and reflect upon what it is that we're trying to inculcate with peace education. Alexander?
Thank you so much, Ramu. Yes, that is a critical question and a critical issue as well. This is the concern. How do we, and I wonder if it's really the inculcation, but it is the invitation for people, learners of all walks of life, to human well with each other. Remember, I was mentioning the issue of collective intelligence. And what we are looking for, I think, as a species, is not to have a monolithic engagement with one right way of looking at the world, one right way of being human. There's no such thing. What we're looking for, I might call full spectrum humaning. Full spectrum humaning would be to know that there are many ways of being human, that we don't have to embody all of them, but we can celebrate all the colors of the rainbow. Even though our favorite color might be yellow or blue or red, that's fine. But to know that there are many different ways of being human. And so this full spectrum humaning goes along with the notions of going beyond just problem solving. So again, as we mentioned earlier, life is not a problem to be solved, and people are not problems to be fixed. So how do we relate to each other and to life? Yes, problem solving is important and has its place, particularly in things that involve definitive answers, engineering and areas that have, we need to have precision. But in listening with your heart and in learning in peace education, it is so important to learn not just the rational approaches, but the approaches of the heart, intuition, and care. So is empathy the right term? It's a great question. Is it strong enough? I don't know. But maybe another term which might be stronger, weaker, more difficult, love. It fundamentally is, how are we a loving being? And it doesn't mean the love that the English language has one word, love. I mean, the Greeks have 7. We can talk about it more in terms, I don't want to go through all the points, but they have brotherly love, they have a love in the family, the parental love, sibling love, they have love of life, agape, all of this different forms. And how can we celebrate the joy of life and celebrate that in others as well? The last point here with this, and then I'll pass it back to you, is lifelong learning. We talked about a little bit about that, and Willow, your things that you were doing is just so inspirational. This is I think the path that can really empower the beauty in all of us to be our fullest selves, right? And when we listen for that in others, then we create the conditions for humaning well in full spectrum humaning. But it goes beyond lifelong learning. It goes to what I call life-wide learning. How can our educational systems include life-wide learning? And life-wide learning means learning in your context, not just in school, not just in the classroom, learning where you are, learning about life, part of the full spectrum humaning. I'll end there.
Thank you, Alexander. And I think that's it's a very powerful idea to bring in the concept of love, even in a single dimension or a single meaning, because I think we're all too often a little coy or wary or shy of using that term, and we come up with all kinds of synonyms, politically acceptable synonyms, rather than realize that ultimately education, culture are intensely personal, just as love is, and therefore being personal must further a personal cause. But that's just a reflection. I don't know what you feel, Willow, about that and about empathy in general.
So thank you, Ramu. And I agree, it may be a matter of semantics in a way. Perhaps I was an English teacher for a few years, but it is perhaps correct that in some ways empathy is a politically correct term for what we would like to call love. I love your terminology, Alexander. I see you really like words like full spectrum humanity, life-wide learning. Beautiful. I would give an example of what is politically correctly called empathy in northern Benin in West Africa, where the migrant herders are in constant conflict with the farmers. And a village chief heard about the peace education program, I believe because his son was involved in it, and requested to have the program brought to these people, many of whom are illiterate, have not been to school as many of the people participating in this Peace Education Network Day have been educated. And actually he brought it, and it was because the village chief requested it. They dutifully came and attended. It was conducted in French. And what was amazing was the herders and the farmers loved it so much and wanted to bring it to their families and to everyone because of what they learned about these different themes was so important to them. And those are two of the languages we're currently working on, of course, being translated by the local people, Peul and Bariba, because the people didn't understand French. And to me, this says a lot about these feelings of love in its broadest sense. They love their community. They love what they do. They don't want, and this is serious conflict. It's deadly conflict. They don't want to be killing each other, but that's what they've always done. So that definitely goes beyond empathy.
No, that's a very, very powerful analogy. In fact, it's also illustrative about how the most unexpected of lessons, we are still using the education metaphor, can come from parts of the world with which we may not be as familiar as we would like. Benin, to which you made reference, is one of the only two countries in the world to have issued Sustainable Development Goals bonds, where people invest in education, for instance, in that country. And as a result of that investment, the value of their bonds increases over time. So that idea of imagination in planning, and as you mentioned, this wonderful story of the herdsman of Benin, it shows in a sense, to go back to Alexander's phrase, it shows the collective intelligence which can really summon the change which is necessary for a culture of peace.
The United Nations International School was not just for the families of UN diplomats and employees, but I think the biggest education I had in that school, aside from the subject matter learning, which I had, was living with the conviviality, as Ivan Ilyich would talk about, with living with students from all over the world. And it was just natural that we would have, for example, lunchtime. You would have lunch, and the relationship with food is something very particular to different cultures. And so you would have people, or my friends, who their relationship with food is very formal. They would not touch their food except for with their eating implements. Others would be using their hands. Others would be, to show that they were enjoying and appreciating the food, they would burp. This part of what is expected. Others, heaven forbid, they wouldn't. But we enjoyed each other's engagement. And sometimes there would be laughter about it, curiosity, but there would never be any shame. There would never be any judgment, which was fascinating. In fact, when I went to a small liberal arts college afterwards, Haverford College in Pennsylvania, for the first semester, I felt something was very wrong, until I realized it was because everyone all spoke English without accents, and they were all looking fairly much the same. It felt weird. But I think this idea of learning and living with different ways of being was very much inculcated in me, in my experience of the United Nations International School. And I think fun, aside from being fun, being the language in Benin as well, it's also having fun and being able to learn in a way that is celebrating life. I think this is fundamental. Often our learning is almost solemn. And how can we have learning be something that has a sacred but celebratory component? Life has those aspects in it. And how can we bring that into our being? Then, if you permit me, one last thing on this, Ramu, is this notion of the self as instrument. I want to bring this to the fore, because when we really ask ourselves, is this good? Is this right? Is this helpful for that person? Is what I'm doing going to be appreciated by the other? And maybe the other is not somebody who's right next to me. It might be a future generation. Is this something that a future generation? Because we are right now ancestors in training. Right now we are ancestors in training. And how are we doing things that future generations will look back and say, I appreciate my ancestors for doing those things? This is the empathy-oriented education that I think a peace education and creating a culture of peace is calling for. And the collective intelligence that you also mentioned, Ramu, and that Willow you have emphasized as well, is so critical, because the scientists often refer to many of our situations today as VUCA. VUCA is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Some of the social scientists refer to these kind of situations with a different an acronym. They call it RUPT: rapid, unpredictable, paradoxical, and tangled. Whatever you call it, our situations often overwhelm us in today's day. We look at the news, we're overwhelmed. But when we are making sense of it together, collective intelligence, then we can find our way forward together. And I do believe that our path as humanity on this planet is calling for us to find our way forward together. Peace education is essential to this.
Thank you for that, Alexander and Willow. And I must say that the contrast between both your experiences is so vivid. As you mentioned, Willow, you really had to nurture your own interest and find the information for yourself. While Alexander, in the school that you were in, it was all around you. And because it was all around you, it did not seem at all strange or out of place. In my case, I must mention that we had absolutely no real idea of the United Nations when I was in school, except the then Secretary General of the UN, U Thant, came to Delhi and asked to visit a school, and our school was chosen. And he came and spoke to us, and we were so taken with it that students, high school students, demanded of the school principal that a course in UN studies be included, not for credit, not for an examination, but just so that we could listen and learn. And it was one of the most successful courses because they were able to get a number of speakers from various disciplines to talk about how the UN had made a difference in their lives. I'd like to end with one thought. You mentioned also, Alexander, just now, the idea of being overwhelmed, which I think is something which all of us in one way or another face in 2022. Perhaps the world was a little more gentle in 1982 when this entire journey began. When, as I showed you, you had one newspaper in the morning, which really was all the information you could get. You did not have various converging streams of social media and other media which came upon us. Is there a danger that if we talk about peace education, that we will overwhelm the learner, not just, as I said, the school learner, but to go back to the idea of lifelong learning, the lifelong learner? And is there a way that we can avoid that fatigue and the danger of people just shying away from it because they have enough algebra of their own to deal with? Willow?
Excellent question, Ramu. I don't know if I have the answer, but I can give my perspective. And I can cite a few examples, practical examples from people who've gone through the peace education program. It is used in the domestic violence intervention court with people who are on probation. And some of the participants at first said, what, one more thing I have to go through in your programming? Really? And usually some after the first course, some after the second, realize that this is for them. It's not something like mathematics that they think they might not use. I disagree with that, but it's a course that really is about them and for them. And a lot of those participants talk about unlearning, and I think that's about unlearning of behaviors that have been generational, especially with the situation of domestic violence. In a women's prison in Australia with some Aboriginal women who had a lot of challenges in learning basic subjects in school and thought they were no good at them. Going through the peace education program built up their self-confidence and their desire to learn. And all of their other teachers said they became especially better at writing essays because they found something to write about. They started finding themselves and a reconnection with their own culture or culture. As you mentioned, Alexander, they found their tribal culture through the program and were able to have things that they were joyful about and could celebrate and write about. So I suppose it depends on how it's presented. If it's a mandatory course and just one more thing on a long list of courses, then it could feel overwhelming. But I think that in any peace education program, an outcome would be feeling relief from that overwhelm.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Willow. Alexander?
Well, just to really echo what Willow was saying, I think you captured that beautifully, Willow. If we're looking at education as truly a transformative process, not not one that transforms you into something you're not, but exactly transforms you into something you are. It transforms you into your truest self. And that means humaning well. How do you transforming into your full humanness, right? And we don't do that alone. Again, the key here is really, it is very hard to human by yourself. You really human in relationship. So relational intelligence is part of this, and that involves empathetic intelligence, connective intelligence, and collective intelligence. These are all different forms of engaging, but the relational intelligence means seeing and acting in terms of relational dynamics. Peace education is all about that. And in fact, my work with Unity Foundation as the Vice President for Education is exactly on understanding how and creating the conditions for ways in which all of humanity can learn with and from each other across all the boundaries. The problem is when we see boundaries as barriers. And this is the thing. These barriers can always be transmuted into boundaries. Boundaries can be permeable. We can respect each other's boundaries. That's very important. But we can also allow these not to be barriers for our relational dynamics. How do we transmute that? How do we do the transformational engagement that allows us to relate to each other and not to set up barriers that don't permit us to relate, except for in conflictual terms, right? This is the positive aspect of peace education, not just removing the conflict, but creating positive relational dynamics. Peace education is very much dedicated to that.
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Willow. That's been a fascinating conversation. And I really hope that when the next time the three of us meet, we would have an International Day of Peace Education decided upon. And I'm sure both of you can contribute to the idea of its theme every year, so that we really have a global movement that will allow us to learn through lesson and example, but perhaps far more important than either, to learn through being oneself, because at the heart of it, each one of us is peace-loving. It's only when we apprehend violence or when we have violence committed against us that we ourselves turn brutal. So let's look forward to that, to a culture of peace that unites a world which has so much to divide it, but yet can change. My gratitude to both of you, Willow and Alexander, and my thanks to the wonderful team who have put this together, Darlene and David and Jim. Thank you, Michael, for your introduction. And I must thank an old friend who is often quietly in the background, Bill McCarthy of the Unity Foundation, who, as I mentioned, has been such a staunch ally of the United Nations and of the global cause to which our conversation today is dedicated. Thank you, and onwards.
I'm signing the petition for the official United Nations Peace Education Day.
And I'm signing a petition requesting that the United Nations declare a Global Peace Education Day.
Right now, I'm signing the petition for an official UN Global Peace Education Day.